Bone crunches under heavy boots. A heartbeat monitor flatlines, a shrill scream cutting through a sterile room. Panic swallows the surgical team whole. One woman doesn't flinch. She steps into the chaos, eyes dead set, hands steady. To them, she is nobody. To the abyss, she is an old friend. The emergency department at 3 a.m. does not resemble the polished, high-stakes dramas broadcast on television. It is a gritty, fluorescent-lit purgatory. It smells of bleach, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of human desperation. It is a place of endless waiting, punctuated by moments of sheer, unadulterated terror. Sarah Collins stood in the corner of Trauma Bay 2, a fresh pair of nitrile gloves pulled over her hands. She wore oversized, faded green scrubs that hid the sharp angles of her shoulders and the thick, jagged scar tracing its way up her left forearm. At 34, she looked perpetually tired. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun, and her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held the distant, quiet look of someone who had seen the bottom of the world and decided it wasn't worth talking about. Tonight, Sarah was the float nurse. In the rigid hierarchy of a hospital, a float nurse is a necessary ghost. You belong to no specific ward. You have no home unit. You are plugged into whatever hole is sinking the fastest. The regular staff doesn't know your name, doesn't trust your skills, and usually treats you as a liability until proven otherwise. Sarah preferred it this way. It kept people at a distance. It kept the questions to a minimum. Collins! Brenda, the charge nurse, barked from the doorway, holding a clipboard like a shield. Brenda was 50, fueled entirely by caffeine and spite, and had zero patience for newcomers. You're in here. Dr. Hayes is on call. He's particular. Don't speak unless spoken to. Hand him what he asks for before he asks for it. And for the love of God, don't get in his way. He ate the last 2 floaters alive. Understood, Sarah said. Her voice was flat, carrying no inflection. Brenda narrowed her eyes, trying to read the new hire, but gave up. Just stay out of the blast zone. 10 minutes later, Dr. Richard Hayes walked into the bay. He didn't just enter a room. He occupied it. Hayes was in his late 30s, brilliant and acutely aware of it. His white coat was perfectly pressed, his expensive leather clogs spotless. He was the hospital's golden boy, a trauma surgeon with a reputation for miraculous saves and a bedside manner that bordered on sociopathic. He demanded absolute perfection from his team, mostly because he believed his own presence demanded it. Hayes looked around the trauma bay, his eyes lingering on a resident who was frantically checking the suction lines, before his gaze snapped to Sarah. "Who are you?" he asked, not bothering to lower the chart in his hands. Sarah, floating tonight. Hayes sighed. A sharp, exasperated sound. A floater. Perfect. Listen to me very carefully, Sarah. In my bay, we do not hesitate. We do not second guess. If I ask for a clamp, I want it in my palm before the word leaves my mouth. If you don't know where something is, get out of the room and find someone who does. I do not have time to teach you how to be a nurse. Sarah looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't flush with embarrassment or bristle with anger like most nurses would. She just nodded once. Understood, doctor. Hayes dismissed her instantly, turning his attention to the resident to quiz him on chest tube insertions. Sarah went back to checking the crash cart. She opened the drawers, her eyes scanning the neatly arranged vials of epinephrine, atropine, and amiodarone. Her hands moved over the equipment with a practiced, unconscious rhythm. She checked the seals on the chest drainage systems. She tested the oxygen regulators. She watched Hayes from the corner of her eye. She noted the way he held his shoulders, the rapid cadence of his speech. He was a peacetime doctor. Good hands, terrible nerves. He was used to controlling the environment. He was used to the sterile, predictable nature of textbook anatomy. Sarah knew what happened when the environment fought back. She knew what happened when anatomy turned to soup. At 3:42 a.m., The overhead radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice tight with adrenaline. St. Jude Trauma, be advised. Incoming mass casualty, multi-vehicle pileup on I-95, followed by a secondary explosion. We have 3 reds incoming. ETA 2 minutes. 1 priority alpha, male, late 20s, multiple penetrating shrapnel wounds to the thorax and abdomen. BP is 70 over palp. Heart rate 140. He's fading fast. The boredom in the ER vanished, replaced by a sudden electric tension. "All right, people, listen up," Hayes yelled, clapping his hands together. "Gowns, gloves, masks. I want O-negative blood on standby. 2 units uncrossed. Get the rapid infuser primed. Floater." He snapped his fingers at Sarah. "You're on the infuser. Do not mess up the lines." Sarah was already holding the primed tubing. "Ready, doctor." The double doors at the end of the hall crashed open. The sound came first. The frantic shouting of paramedics. The heavy squeal of gurney wheels on linoleum. The chaotic symphony of a life slipping away. They rushed the gurney into Bay 2. The patient was a mess. His clothes were shredded, soaked through with dark arterial blood. His skin was the colour of old wax. He was taking shallow, ragged gasps, his chest barely rising. "Transfer on 3, a paramedic yelled. 1, 2, 3. They hoisted the man onto the trauma table. The room exploded into motion. "He's crashing," the resident shouted, struggling to secure an airway. "Get him intubated now," Hayes barked, grabbing a pair of trauma shears and cutting away the remains of the patient's shirt. The moment the fabric fell away, a fresh wave of blood spilled over the table, pooling onto the floor. The patient's abdomen was severely distended, rigid to the touch. A piece of jagged metal, likely a torn door panel from the explosion, had ripped through his lower left quadrant. "Massive hemoperitoneum," Hayes said, his voice rising in pitch. "He's bleeding out internally. We need to open him right here. Get me a scalpel. 10 blade." Sarah was already holding it out. Hayes snatched it without looking. He made a swift, brutal incision down the center of the patient's abdomen. As the cavity opened, blood erupted outward, soaking the front of Hayes's sterile gown. The volume of blood was catastrophic. The rapid infuser was pumping O-negative into the patient's veins, but he was losing it faster than they could replace it. "Suction! Get the suction in here!" Hayes yelled, his hands disappearing into the pool of red, desperately searching for the source of the bleed. The resident shoved the suction wand into the cavity, but the thick, dark blood immediately clogged the tip. The monitor above them began to scream. The rhythmic beeping of the patient's heart rate became a frantic, erratic stutter. BP 50 over palp. "I can't see anything," Hayes shouted, panic bleeding into his authoritative tone. He was frantically shifting organs, his hands slipping. "Where is it coming from? It's the spleen. It has to be the spleen. Clamp. Give me a large Kelly." Sarah looked at the dark, pulsating flow of blood. It wasn't the spleen. The blood was too bright, the flow too rhythmic. It was arterial. It was deep. It was coming from the descending aorta, or a major iliac branch. A Kelly clamp would be useless. He was digging in the wrong place. She handed him the Kelly clamp anyway, but simultaneously grabbed a set of large lap sponges. Hayes jammed the clamp blindly into the cavity. "I can't get a grip. He's bleeding too fast." BP 40 over palp. "Doctor, his pressure is bottoming out," the anesthesiologist called from the head of the bed. "He's going into hypovolemic shock. You have about 60 seconds before he codes." Hayes froze. It was only a fraction of a second, but Sarah saw it. She had seen it 100 times before in the dust of foreign cities. It was the hesitation of a man who realized his textbook had run out of pages. The sheer violence of the injury had overwhelmed his clinical algorithm. He was drowning in it. "Give me another clamp," Hayes yelled, his voice cracking. He turned his head and glared at Sarah. "What are you doing? Don't just stand there with the sponges. Give me a right-angle clamp. I told them not to give me a floating nurse. Get out of my way and get someone in here who knows what the hell they're doing." Sarah did not flinch. She dropped the clamp. Hey, what are you? Sarah stepped forward, physically bumping Hayes to the side with her hip. Hey, get your hands off my table! Hayes roared, his face flushing dark red. Sarah ignored him. She plunged both of her hands directly into the patient's open abdominal cavity. She bypassed the superficial organs, pushing her forearms deep into the pooling blood. She didn't rely on sight. She relied on touch. She felt for the dense, muscular column of the spine. Her fingers slid down the slick bone until she felt the pulsing torn vessel. It was the abdominal aorta, just above the bifurcation. With a brutal, calculated grip, she pressed her knuckles hard against the vessel, pinning the torn artery directly against the patient's spine, cutting off the blood flow to the lower half of his body. "What the hell are you doing?" Hayes screamed, grabbing her shoulder. "Security! Get her out of here! She's killing him!" "Look at the monitor," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the screaming room like a gunshot. Everyone froze. The resident, the anesthesiologist, even Hayes. They looked up. The erratic, plunging line on the monitor stopped falling. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbers began to climb. BP 60/40. BP 75/50. The frantic bleeding in the abdominal cavity slowed to a sluggish ooze. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands buried deep in the patient's chest, her posture rigid, using her body weight to maintain the immense pressure required to keep the artery clamped against the bone. "It's a manual aortic compression," Sarah said, her voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of the panic echoing in the room. "The tear is distal to the renal arteries. You were searching too high. You have a clean field now, Dr. Hayes." Hayes stared at her, his mouth slightly open. The arrogance had been wiped completely from his face, replaced by shock. "He's stable," the anesthesiologist whispered, disbelief coloring his words. "Pressures are holding." Sarah locked eyes with the surgeon. "You have about 4 minutes of ischemia time before his lower extremities start taking permanent damage, doctor. I suggest you find the tear and throw a stitch." Hayes blinked, snapping back to reality. The humiliation hit him a second later, but the surgeon in him took over. He grabbed a suction wand, cleared the remaining pooled blood, and finally saw the massive tear exactly where Sarah's hand was pinned. "Proline suture," Hayes snapped, his voice shaky but focused. "Now." For the next 10 minutes, the room was dead silent, save for the steady beep of the monitor and the quiet metallic click of surgical instruments. Sarah didn't move. She kept her grip absolute, her muscles burning, until Hayes finally secured the artery and nodded. Slowly, she eased her pressure. The vessel held. The blood stayed in the pipes. "Vascular repair holds," Hayes said, tying off the final knot. He stepped back from the table, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his bloody gown. The crisis had passed. The patient would live to see the ICU. The silence in the room shifted from focused tension to heavy, suffocating awkwardness. Every nurse and resident in the bay was staring at Sarah. Sarah quietly pulled her hands from the cavity. She stripped off her bloody gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin, and walked over to the sink to wash her hands. She pumped the cheap pink soap and scrubbed the red from her forearms, her face giving nothing away. Hayes ripped his gown off, throwing it to the floor. He marched over to the sink, standing uncomfortably close to her. His pride was deeply, fatally wounded. "Do not ever," Hayes hissed, his voice low and trembling with rage, "disobey a direct order in my trauma bay again. You are a floater. You are a guest in my ER. You do not touch my patients, and you do not ever lay hands on me." Sarah rinsed her hands under the warm water. She dried them meticulously on a paper towel. "Your patient was bleeding to death, doctor," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I had it under control." Hayes spat. Sarah finally turned to look at him. Those pale blue eyes locked onto his, and for a terrifying second, Hayes felt cold. "No," she said softly. "You didn't." She tossed the paper towel into the trash and walked past him, heading back out to the main floor to check the Pixies machine. Hayes watched her go, his jaw tight. He turned to the charge nurse, Brenda, who had watched the entire thing from the doorway. "I want her fired," Hayes demanded. "By tomorrow morning, I want her out of this hospital. I don't care who she thinks she is." The morning sun did nothing to warm the administrative offices of St. Jude Medical Center. The light filtered through the horizontal blinds, casting harsh, rigid lines across the frosted glass door of the chief medical officer's suite. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a dull, relentless drone. The room smelled of lemon pledge and the specific, suffocating brand of bureaucratic authority that only hospital administration can perfect. Sarah sat in a high-backed leather chair. She had not slept. She was still wearing the same faded green scrubs, though she had changed her top after the blood soaked through. Her posture was straight, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Across the wide mahogany desk sat Dr. Robert Caldwell, the chief medical officer. Caldwell was a man who had traded the messy reality of patient care for spreadsheets and liability management a decade ago. He looked tired. To Caldwell's left sat an HR representative named Susan, furiously typing on a slim laptop. And pacing the floor behind them was Dr. Richard Hayes. Hayes looked entirely different in the daylight. Out of his blood-spattered surgical gown and wrapped in a tailored navy suit, his confidence had returned. He looked sharp, indignant, and fully prepared to execute a professional execution. "Insubordination," Hayes said, chopping the air with his hand. "Physical assault on a superior, endangerment of a critical patient, and operating entirely outside her scope of practice. Bob, we don't need a tribunal for this. It's open and shut." She pushed me away from the table. She shoved her hands into an open abdominal cavity without authorization. "She needs to be terminated immediately, and I want a report filed with the state nursing board." Caldwell rubbed the bridge of his nose, pushing his reading glasses up into his thinning hair. He looked down at the thick file on his desk. It wasn't just an incident report. It was Sarah's employment file. "Dr. Hayes, please sit down," Caldwell said, his voice weary. "You're making me dizzy." Hayes scoffed but took the seat next to Sarah, ensuring there was a noticeable gap between them. He glared at her. She didn't return the look. She was staring at a small water stain on the ceiling tile above Caldwell's head. "Ms. Collins," Caldwell began, flipping open her file. "Dr. Hayes's report is severe. He claims you physically displaced him during a critical trauma intervention and performed a manual aortic compression." "That is correct," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, empty of defense or apology. Susan's typing paused. Caldwell frowned. Usually when staff were brought into this office, they cried. They begged. They offered lengthy, panicked explanations. Sarah offered nothing. "You admit to it," Hayes sneered. "You admit to assaulting an attending surgeon." "I admit to displacing you, yes," Sarah said, finally turning her pale blue eyes to Hayes. "You were clamping blindly into the upper left quadrant. The laceration was at the bifurcation of the aorta. The patient was in profound hypovolemic shock. He had perhaps 45 seconds of cardiac output remaining. You were panicked. I intervened to arrest the hemorrhage." Hayes's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. "I was not panicked. I was methodically securing the field. You are a float nurse. You distribute medication and empty bedpans. You do not diagnose surgical bleeds." "I didn't diagnose it," Sarah replied quietly. "I felt it." "This is ridiculous," Hayes snapped, turning to Caldwell. "Fire her. Now." Caldwell held up a hand. He was staring at the second page of Sarah's file. He squinted, adjusting his glasses. "Ms. Collins," Caldwell said slowly, "your employment history here is sparse. You came to us through an agency. Before that, you were a contractor. But prior to that, your work history is almost entirely military. 10 years. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. It says here you were a nurse, but the specific units and duty stations are heavily redacted. Caldwell tapped the paper. I don't usually see redactions in a standard DD-214 discharge document. I signed a non-disclosure agreement regarding my operational deployments, Sarah stated flatly. The agency has my unclassified credentials. I assure you, my licensing is current. I don't care if she was Florence Nightingale, Hayes shouted, slamming a hand on the armrest. She broke protocol. She assaulted me. If this hospital retains her, I will tender my resignation. I will not work in an environment where my authority is undermined by transient staff. Choose Bob, the floater, or your chief of trauma. It was a brilliant, brutal ultimatum. Hayes brought in millions in revenue. He was the face of the trauma center's marketing campaigns. Sarah was a nameless cog who cost $50 an hour. Caldwell let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at Sarah. There was a flicker of genuine pity in his eyes. Sarah, Caldwell said gently, regardless of the patient's outcome, and I do acknowledge the patient survived, you understand that we cannot operate a hospital with vigilante medicine. There is a chain of command. There are strict protocols designed to protect the patient and the hospital from liability. You crossed a line, a massive one. Sarah nodded slowly. I understand the civilian protocols, Dr. Caldwell. I also understand that a dead patient is the ultimate liability. But I accept your decision. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She knew how this world worked. It was a world of paperwork, egos, and optics. She had spent a decade in a different world, a world of dirt, diesel, and survival, where the only metric that mattered was whether the chest was still rising. She didn't belong here. She had known it since the day she took the job. Caldwell closed the file. Effective immediately, your contract with St. Jude Medical Center is terminated. Susan will process your final. The heavy wooden door to the suite opened. It didn't swing open politely. It was pushed open with a firm, deliberate force that bypassed the secretary outside entirely. 5 men walked into the room. They did not look like doctors. They did not look like hospital administrators. They wore civilian clothes, faded denim, dark jackets, heavy boots, but they wore them like uniforms. They moved with a synchronized, quiet grace that instantly dominated the cramped office. They were men built of dense muscle and hard angles, their eyes scanning the room, assessing threats, cataloguing exits. They carried an atmosphere of compressed violence, leashed and perfectly disciplined. The man at the front had iron-grey hair cut close to his scalp and a face lined by decades of relentless sun. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. "Excuse me," Caldwell stammered, half rising from his chair. "You cannot be in here. This is a closed meeting." Hayes stood up, puffing his chest. "Hey, how did you get past security? Get out of here before I call the police." The grey-haired man didn't even look at Hayes. His eyes swept over Caldwell, dismissed him, and landed squarely on Sarah. The tension in the man's shoulders dropped. A quiet, profound relief washed over his weathered face. "We checked the ER," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small room. "Charge nurse said they dragged you up to the principal's office." Sarah stood up. For the first time since the surgery, for the first time since she had walked into this hospital, the defensive armor around her cracked. Her breath caught in her throat. "Commander," Sarah whispered. Commander Jack Reynolds smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "Hello, Doc." He stepped forward, bridging the gap, and wrapped his thick arms around her. Sarah closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The other 4 men filed into the room, their expressions softening. One by one, they stepped up to touch her shoulder, to nod, to offer a quiet murmur of greeting. Hayes watched this display, his mouth hanging open. The arrogance was rapidly bleeding out of him, replaced by a sudden, intense unease. These men were intimidating in a way that had nothing to do with job titles or bank accounts. I demand to know what is going on here, Hayes said, though his voice lacked its previous volume. Who are you people? Reynolds slowly pulled back from Sarah. He turned his head, fixing his dark, unblinking eyes on the surgeon. The air in the room grew suddenly, suffocatingly cold. I'm Commander Reynolds, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Reynolds said, his voice dead flat. And you are the man currently yelling at my chief. Caldwell swallowed hard. Naval. You're SEALs. We are, Reynolds said. He looked back at Sarah, taking in the tired lines around her eyes, the faded scrubs. We came into town for the anniversary. The boys wanted to track you down. Took us 3 months to find through the agency. Why didn't you tell us where you went, Sarah? I just needed quiet, Jack, she murmured, looking down at her hands. I just needed some quiet. You? One of the younger men in the back laughed softly. Quiet? Doc, you used to sleep through mortar barrages in Fallujah. Hayes, desperate to regain control of the room, stepped forward. I don't care what she used to do. She's a hazard. She just shoved her hands into a trauma patient's chest like a cowboy and assaulted me in the process. We were just firing her. The room went dead silent. The 5 men stopped smiling. They turned, moving almost as a single entity, and focused entirely on Hayes. Hayes instinctively took a step back, hitting the edge of Caldwell's desk. Reynolds stepped close to the surgeon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You think she's a cowboy? Reynolds asked softly. You think you know what trauma is? Hayes swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. I am the chief of trauma surgery here. Congratulations, Reynolds said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. You fix car crashes. You fix gangbangers. You work in a sterile room with bright lights, endless blood supply, and an army of assistants. Reynolds pointed a calloused finger at Sarah. That woman, Reynolds continued, was the senior en route care specialist for Tier 1 operations. For 5 years, she was the only thing standing between my men and a body bag. I watched her perform a field thoracotomy in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter taking heavy ground fire with night vision goggles on, using a headlamp and a prayer. She kept 3 men alive who were missing limbs, simultaneously, in the dirt of a compound in Syria. Caldwell looked down at the redacted file on his desk, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The blank spaces weren't clerical errors. They were state secrets. If she pushed you out of the way, Reynolds said, stepping so close to Hayes that the surgeon had to lean backward, it's because you were failing. If she put her hands inside your patient, it's because you were going to let him die. You don't fire a woman like Sarah Collins. You get out of her way and you take notes. Hayes was trembling. He looked at Caldwell for support, but the chief medical officer was staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and profound awe. Caldwell stammered, closing the file and sliding it slowly across the desk. I think there has been a misunderstanding. The termination paperwork has not been signed, and given the exceptional circumstances of the save. Keep your job, Sarah said. Everyone looked at her. She picked up her worn canvas backpack from the floor and slung it over one shoulder. Her face was calm, the heavy, tired burden suddenly looking a little lighter. I don't belong here, Sarah said, looking at Caldwell, then briefly at Hayes. I did what I had to do to keep the man breathing. But I don't fit in your pristine world, Dr. Hayes. Your ego requires an audience. I just require a pulse. She turned toward the door. Doc, Reynolds said. Sarah stopped. The 5 men stood in a perfect line. They didn't say a word. They simply snapped to attention, their boots clicking together against the linoleum. Slowly, deliberately, they raised their hands in a crisp, immaculate salute. It was not a hospital protocol. It was not a bureaucratic formality. It was an acknowledgement of blood, of sacrifice, and of a bond forged in the darkest corners of the earth. Sarah stared at them, her chest tightening, the pale blue of her eyes finally welling with unshed tears. She didn't salute back. She wasn't in uniform anymore. But she nodded, a deep, respectful acknowledgement. She turned and walked out the door, leaving the quiet, shattered egos of the hospital administration behind her. She walked out into the bright morning sun, no longer just a floating nurse, but a phantom of the battlefield, finally heading home. Thank you for watching to the very end of Sarah's incredible journey. If this story of unsung heroism, unbreakable bonds, and putting ego in its place moved you, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true strength doesn't need a loud voice. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, gripping stories just like this one, and leave a comment below with your favorite moment.